The dust had barely settled on Main Street when Luke Short holstered his smoking Colt .45 and watched another challenger collapse to the wooden planks of Dodge City. 23 men had tried to outdraw him. 23 men had failed. The crowd that gathered after each gunfight grew smaller these days, Faye, not because people feared the violence, but because the outcome had become as predictable as the sunset. Women no longer gasped. Children no longer stared in wide-eyed wonder. Even the Undertaker, old Pete Garrison, had started showing up before the gunfights began, his measuring tape already in hand. Luke Short wasn't born to be a killer. He started as a whiskey drummer, traveling from saloon to saloon across Kansas, selling liquid courage to cowboys and drifters who needed something stronger than coffee to face another day on the unforgiving frontier. But the West had a way of reshaping men like clay in a potter's hands. And when you carried iron on your hip, eventually someone would test your resolve. The first time Luke killed a man, Faye, a drunken cowpoke named Billy McGraw, who'd called him a cheating card, sharp Faye, his hands shook for 3 days. He couldn't eat solid food, couldn't sleep without seeing McGraw's surprised face in his dreams. By the 10th killing, he slept like a baby and ate steak for breakfast. What made Luke different from other gunfighters wasn't just his speed, Faye, though. Witnesses swore his draw was faster than a snake strike and twice as deadly. It was his mind. While other men relied on instinct and adrenaline, Luke approached every duel like a chess game played with bullets instead of pieces. He studied his opponents for days, learning their habits, their tells, their weaknesses. Did they favor their right foot when they drew? Did they blink twice before reaching for their gun? Did they hold their breath or exhale when they fired? Luke cataloged every detail in his memory, because in a world where death came in the space between heartbeats, information was the difference between walking away and being carried away in a pine box. The people of Dodge City called him the Professor Faye, not because he was educated, though he was one of the few gunfighters who could read and write well enough to compose letters home to his sister in Ohio, but because he approached killing with the methodical precision of a scholar studying ancient texts. He kept a small leather journal where he recorded the names of every man he'd faced, noting their technique, their last words, whether they had family waiting somewhere, and how many seconds it took for the light to fade from their eyes. Luke Short may have been a killer, but he wasn't without conscience. Each name in that journal was a weight on his soul, a debt that would someday come due. By the spring of 1883, Luke's reputation had spread across 3 states like wildfire through dry grass. Men traveled hundreds of miles just to face him, drawn by the promise of eternal fame that would come from being the one to finally put Luke Short in the ground. Some came for money. Faye, there were bounties on Luke's head from families of men he'd killed. Others came for glory, believing that defeating the most feared gunmen in the West would make them legends. But fame was a double-edged sword, sharper than any blade. The better he became, the more desperate his challengers grew. They came younger and more reckless, seeking glory without understanding the weight of the iron they carried, or the finality of the game they wanted to play. It was on a Tuesday morning in early May, just after the spring rains had turned the streets into rivers of mud that sucked at your boots and splattered up onto your pants, when Luke first saw the boy. He couldn't have been more than 12, maybe 13 at most, standing outside the Long Branch Saloon with a gun belt that was too big for his narrow hips and a hat that kept slipping down over his eyes. The holster hung nearly to his knee, and the Colt Peacemaker inside looked like it weighed more than the kid did. His clothes were travel, worn and patched in several places, suggesting a long journey from somewhere far away. Luke was sitting on the porch of the Dodge house, cleaning his fingernails with the tip of his knife and watching the morning traffic of cowboys, merchants, and drifters navigate the muddy street, when he noticed the boy staring at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. It wasn't the usual mixture of fear and fascination he saw in most people's eyes when they recognized him. This was different. This was hatred, pure and cold as winter steel, concentrated into a gaze that seemed to pierce right through him. "You got business with me, son," Luke called out, his voice carrying easily across the muddy street. He kept his tone casual, but his hand instinctively moved closer to his gun. The boy didn't answer immediately. He stood there in the drizzling rain, water dripping from the brim of his oversized hat, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. His whole body was tense, coiled like a spring ready to snap. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady despite his youth, carrying a weight that belonged on someone much older. "My name is Samuel Morrison. You killed my father." The words hit Luke like a physical blow, landing in his stomach with the force of a mule's kick. Morrison. He remembered the name from his journal, entry number 17, written in his careful script. A cattle rustler from Amarillo who'd challenged Luke outside a saloon in Abilene on a hot August night. Morrison had been drunk, stumbling, an easy kill that had lasted less than 5 seconds from the moment they squared off. Luke had given him every chance to walk away, even bought him a drink and tried to talk him out of it. But pride and whiskey had sealed the man's fate as surely as a hangman's noose. "Your father was a rustler and a thief," Luke said, standing slowly from his chair, his joints creaking from too many years of sleeping on hard ground and harder beds. "He drew on me first. I didn't have a choice. He was trying to feed his family," Samuel shot back, his young voice cracking with emotion, but never wavering in conviction. "You didn't have to kill him. You could have wounded him. You could have shot the gun out of his hand. You could have let him walk away with his dignity intact." Luke felt something twist in his chest, an emotion he hadn't experienced in years, buried so deep he'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Guilt, real honest guilt that cut through all his justifications and rationalizations like a knife through paper. He'd told himself so many times that every man he'd killed had chosen their fate, that they'd forced his hand by drawing first. But looking at this boy, seeing the pain etched in lines that were far too deep for such a young face, Luke began to question the mathematics of his conscience. "Kid, your father made his choice when he strapped on that gun. I don't enjoy killing, but I won't apologize for staying alive. This world doesn't give second chances to men who hesitate." Samuel's hand moved to his gun, and Luke saw something in the boy's stance that made his blood run cold, despite the warm spring morning, despite his age, despite his size. Samuel Morrison had the posture of someone who knew how to use the iron on his hip. His feet were positioned correctly shoulder, width apart with the right foot slightly back. His weight was evenly distributed, ready to shift at a moment's notice. His elbow was bent at just the right angle. Someone had been training him, and training him well. "Who taught you to shoot, boy?" "My Uncle Jake. He was a Texas Ranger before the war, rode with Captain McNeil's company. He said if I was going to come after you, I needed to be ready. He said you'd killed enough good men that someone had to stop you." Samuel's eyes never left Luke's face, studying him with the same intensity Luke usually reserved for his opponents. "I've been practicing for 2 years, every day. 12 hours a day when there was light to see by. I can hit a silver dollar at 50 paces, put 6 shots in a space the size of your heart in less than 10 seconds. Luke's mind raced through the implications. A Texas Ranger's training was nothing to dismiss lightly. Those men had learned to shoot fast and accurate because their lives depended on it every single day. If this boy had been trained by a real ranger, he might actually pose a threat. But more troubling than the boy's skill was his dedication. 2 years of practice every single day, driven by nothing but the desire for revenge. That kind of focus, that kind of commitment, was dangerous in anyone, deadly in someone with nothing left to lose. "Listen to me, Samuel. You walk away now, and we'll call this square. You are just a boy. You've got your whole life ahead of you. Find yourself a nice girl. Start a family. Make something good out of your life. Don't throw it all away for revenge. Your father wouldn't want that for you. Like my father threw his life away." Samuel's voice was bitter beyond his years, carrying the weight of too much grief and not enough childhood. "You didn't give him a choice. You didn't show him mercy when he was drunk and stumbling. Why should I show you any? The street had grown quiet except for the sound of rain pattering against the wooden buildings and splashing in the growing puddles. Word had spread quickly through Dodge City that someone was facing down Luke Shortfay news. Like that traveled faster than wildfire in a town starved for excitement. People were gathering at windows and doorways, craning their necks to get a glimpse of what might be the famous gunfighter's final duel. But when they saw his opponent, when they realized they were watching a grown man face off against a child, many turned away in disgust or horror. "This ain't right," someone whispered from a second-story window. "That is just a baby." "Somebody ought to stop this," came another voice. "This ain't Christian." Luke heard the murmurs, felt the weight of judgment from the crowd pressing down on him like a physical force. In all his years of killing, through all 23 duels, he'd maintained a strict code. He only drew on men who were armed and willing. He'd never shot an unarmed man, never killed anyone in the back, never harmed a woman or child. It was the one thing that separated him from the animals, the one line he'd never crossed. But now that code was being tested in ways he'd never imagined. "Boy, I am walking away," Luke said, taking a step backward toward the saloon door. "I won't draw on a child. Find another way to honor your father's memory." "Then you'll die like a coward," Samuel replied, his small hand hovering over his gun like a hawk circling its prey. "My father may have been a rustler, but he faced you like a man. I won't let you dishonor his memory by showing me mercy I don't want." Luke realized with growing horror that the boy was right. In the twisted logic of the frontier, refusing to fight would be seen as cowardice, and cowardice was often punished with a bullet in the back from some ambitious young gun looking to make a name for himself. But more than that, Luke could see that Samuel Morrison wasn't going to let this end peacefully. The boy had traveled hundreds of miles, spent years preparing for this moment. He wasn't going to be talked out of it by pretty words or appeals to reason. "Samuel," Luke said quietly, his voice barely carrying across the space between them, "if I draw on you, I'll win. You know that, don't you? I've killed 23 men. I am faster than your uncle ever was, faster than anyone you've ever seen." "Maybe," the boy replied, rain dripping from his hat brim like tears. "But my uncle taught me something else. He taught me that speed isn't everything. Sometimes the man who is willing to die has the advantage over the man who wants to live." Luke felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cool spring air. He'd heard those words before, from his own mentor, a grizzled old gunfighter named Bat Masterson who'd taken a young Luke under his wing and taught him the deadly arts. The willingness to die was indeed the ultimate weapon, because it freed a man from hesitation, from doubt, from the small delays that could mean the difference between life and death. The minutes stretched like hours as the two figures faced each other in the muddy street. Luke's mind was working frantically, like a chess master trying to find a move that didn't end in checkmate, looking for a way out that wouldn't end with a child's blood on his hands or his own blood soaking into the mud of Dodge City. But Samuel Morrison stood there like a statue carved from stone, his young face set with a determination that belonged on someone 3 times his age. "Last chance, boy," Luke said, knowing even as he spoke that the words were useless. "Walk away. There's been enough killing." Number the word hung in the air like a death sentence, final and irrevocable. Luke Short, the fastest gun in 3 states, the man who'd never lost a duel, found himself in an impossible situation that no amount of skill or experience had prepared him for. Draw on a child and live with the shame forever, becoming the kind of man he'd always despised, or refuse and die in the mud of Dodge City like a dog. What happened next would depend on choices made in the space between heartbeats, where legends were born and souls were damned, where the line between hero and villain became as thin as smoke from a gun barrel. The clock tower of Dodge City began to chime noon, and with each tolling bell, the tension on Main Street grew thicker than the mud beneath their feet. Luke Short's hand hovered inches from his Colt, while across the muddy expanse, a 12-year Old Boy stood ready to avenge his father or die trying. In that moment, Luke Short realized that some battles can't be won with bullets. Some fights are lost before they begin, and sometimes the fastest gun in the West must choose between his reputation and his soul, knowing that whatever choice he makes will haunt him for the rest of his days. The choice he made would echo through the legends of the frontier forever, whispered in saloons and around campfires from Texas to Montana. But that choice, and what happened in the dust and shadow of that Tuesday morning, remains buried in the pages of history, a secret that died with the last witnesses, leaving only questions that time could never answer. What made the fastest gun in the West finally hesitate? What happened when innocence met experience in the deadliest test of the frontier code? And why did Luke Short never speak of that day again for the rest of his life? Some stories are too painful to tell. Some truths are too heavy to bear. And some legends are born not in victory, but in the terrible moment when a man discovers the true cost of his reputation. The dust settled. The crowd dispersed. But the questions remain, echoing across more than a century of Western mythology, waiting for someone brave enough to seek the answers in the shadows of the past.